could close the doors at the back as well. Thank you very much. Oh, don't lock them. Ready to go. Thank you. Well, welcome back to the afternoon session. We've seen some history this morning. We're sort of fast forwarding a little bit through the first two talks to more recent times. And I did a quick calculation, and I remember the first time I met Adrian, who I will introduce in a minute, almost 36 years to the day, so modern times. And I wouldn't be here if I hadn't accidentally run into him when he turned up as a shiny new professor of statistics, probably at that time the youngest professor of statistics in the UK ever. I've got some data. Many of you know Adrian. Many of you that don't know him know of his work and of the profound impact he's had in the last 30, 40 years on statistics and other things that I'll allude to in a second. You will know of his work in modeling and foundations, his work in applications of Bayesian methods and really carrying the flag into many areas of applications in the 80s and 90s, and of course computation. Another little piece of his academic career has been his profound impact on students. He advised approaching 50 students in a little over 25 years. And many of you would not be here without those students having gone through that experience. Adrian really founded or refounded and led the statistics group at the University of Nottingham, which in the 1980s was the center of Bayesian statistics in the UK and arguably in Europe. Then he did the same thing again for about 10 years at Imperial College. Created and redefined the department in a Bayesian model. In 1998, he became the principal of Queen Mary's College, one of the 18 colleges of the University of London system, and continued to do statistics, but he had other things on his mind most of the days he was at work. In 2008, he moved into the civil service as a senior civil servant. He was appointed as the Director General of Science and Research in the UK, which is the body that oversees basically higher education funding and all of the research councils. He did so well there in the first couple of years that they reconfigured the ministries and the offices that he was involved in, and they gave him a much fancier title, UK Director General for Knowledge and Innovation. Don't you love that? All knowledge and innovation in the UK. Adrian's done many things. You can visit his Wikipedia site to find out how heavily he's been involved in national level, policy-oriented thinking, often involving statistics in basically every area of societal interest. And of course, professionally, he's been recognized multifariously. I'll just note he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society 12 years ago and received a knighthood in the Queen's New Year's Honours List in 2011. Last year, just over a year ago, he decided to go back to universities, and now he runs the entire University of London system. He's the, as it says up there, he's the Vice Chancellor of London, among many other things. So I'm personally delighted to see him here and that he's been able to take the time out to come back to his intellectual roots. And as you can see, we've got a fairly different format for Adrian's presentation today. We're going to have a question and answer fireside chat with our leading provocateur here, Alan Gelfand from Duke University. So I'm delighted to welcome and present Professor Sir Adrian Smith. Thank you.
While Adrian is getting mic'd, I would just like to say that we have not rehearsed. This is going to be quite informal, and we're going to count on Adrian's usual entertaining style to save the day. And I just want to observe up front that connecting with Adrian, in fact, was a life-changing experience for me. I have told at least some of you on occasions about my wasted youth and how the sabbatical in Nottingham really changed my life, and I will always be grateful. Shall we begin?
Cheers.
Well, you said informal. Okay, so what we're going to do is just run through some questions. Adrian suggested a few, and I've added a few, and we will see where we get to in about 50 minutes. So just to start, for someone like you entering university in the UK in the first half of the 1960s, what drew you into academic statistics in particular? How did you get into Bayesian statistics, and what was your profile at that time?
Okay, and I want to use my very loosely constructed answers to these questions, really to try and complement those two wonderful presentations this morning. The latter one by Steve Feinberg was a very US-oriented, complete, exhaustive story of what happened in the 50s and 60s. So we did liaise beforehand. So what I want to try and do is give a more UK-Europe perspective. And because there weren't very many of us, I apologize in advance that some of it will be personal, because for quite a bit of the time there were only two of us. So and I also want to use, I've been asked by the organizers, since I was very close to Dennis Lindley, to maybe interleave a bit more than I was intending about relations with Dennis and Dennis's role. So perhaps I could start, and it is an answer to Al's question. How did one end up in the UK, mid-60s, knowing anything about statistics in general, or Bayesian statistics in particular? So I studied mathematics in Cambridge in the mid-1960s. And for almost the entire 3 years I was at Cambridge, statistics didn't appear at all on the curriculum. That was the state of play in the leading mathematics institution in the UK. There was a lot of measure and probability. I could probably get up now and prove Karatai-Dory's theorem. So, but there was virtually no statistics. There was a course of probability taught by somebody called Bob Loynes, who some of you may have heard of. And I actually owe my life in statistics and my association with Dennis almost entirely to a conversation with Bob Loynes. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But during this 3 years in Cambridge, there was a most peculiar 8 hours given by somebody called David McLaren, who you probably never heard of. And he based these lectures around one sheet of A4, which had been divided up into a 2x2 table. So imagine you've got all these bright mathematicians supposedly in Cambridge sitting there. None of us had ever read a book on epistemological probability. None of us had probably handled data in our lives. And this 2x2 table was inference versus decision, frequentist versus personalist. This is around about 64, 65. It's completely abstract, meaningless. But somehow the phrase in the middle of all this, optimal decision making, boy, who wouldn't like to be a macho optimal decision maker? I think that's partly where the seeds were sown. And in my own case, I would have to admit, I wasn't a very dedicated student of mathematics. It seemed to me at the time, mid-1960s, a lot going on in the world, UK politics. Economics in Cambridge was a much more glamorous discipline. It had more women students, start, and higher profile charismatic professors, like a lady, Joan Robinson, who gave lectures in a Mao suit. I thought that was pretty cool. So I went to more economics lectures than was good for my performance in mathematics. Now, at the end of your 3 years in Cambridge in those days, there was no such thing as a career service or whatever. You just bumped into somebody in the faculty and said, what should I do now? And I bumped into Bob Loynes, and I'd chosen him because I enjoyed his probability lectures. And the conversation went roughly as follows. I think it went exactly as follows. He said, what areas of mathematics do you think you've done best at? And I said, measuring probability. He said, what subject have you enjoyed most? And I said, economics. It wasn't the smartest thing to say. So there was an awkward silence, and then he asked me if I'd ever heard of a thing called decision theory. And I muttered something about this in a coherent 8-lecture course. And Loynes then said, well, it's obvious. Given your strength in probability and your interest in economics, statistical decision theory is just the thing for you. And he knew just the man for me to talk to. So he sent me down to London, and that man, of course, was Dennis, who had just moved to take up the chair at University College. So I went down to speak to him, and he kindly offered me a package of 3 years support, 1 year to convert to MSc in statistics, since I didn't know any, followed by 2 years' worth of money to do a PhD. And at the end of it, he said, I think I ought to warn you that I practice an unorthodox form of influence. And I said, I know, I have read your books. And the reason I read his books was because I had a year off between school and going to university. And I had won a national scholarship from an entity called the Central Electricity Generating Board, which was our national producer of electricity. And in the intervening point between school and going to Cambridge, they gave you a job, and they gave you projects. And my project was, I had a lot of data. They were experimenting with building nuclear power stations. And not so much the nuclear bit, but the sets that come off the station, the generating sets. And the question is, do you have very few big sets, or do you have lots of little sets? And because the issue is, if you have lots of little ones and they break down, it's not as damaging. On the other hand, they break down more often. So what's the optimal design? So not having done any probability at school, I thought I'd better learn some probability. And it was just the time, when 1965, when Dennis's books came out. So I bought his books. The only lie I told Dennis was that I'd read them. So I had a great time at University College in London, converting to being a statistician. I did read the books then, of course, cover to cover. But the MSc, in Dennis's first year presiding at UC, was entirely classical, apart from one course from Dennis on Bayesian decision theory. So I did all right, and then I started on a PhD thesis. And I will say some nice things about Dennis as I go along, but I'd like to get one thing off my chest. There was one terrible thing that Dennis did to me. In 1969, the 37th session of the ISI took place in London, of a number of events held at University College. And for some reason, I ended up with a handful of postgrads in charge of the party for the great and the good of world statistics. And that was just like people had walked in off the cover of the Wiley series of books, you know. In came Ted Anderson. He had scotch and soda. I was pouring. And then Sheffey, who just had the soda because he had an ulcer. So you learned something today. Henry Sheffey had an ulcer. He didn't drink in 1969. Florence David, Jesse Neyman, they were all there. So it was a wonderful evening, and great for somebody of my age. They see all these names come off the cover. And at the end of the evening, Neyman, very kind of effusive, just wanted to thank the bar staff for a wonderful evening. So he invited us to join him at a really fancy restaurant in London. Put my coat on, and Dennis told me to take it off. I had to stay behind and wash up. After that, it was all positive. So I did my PhD with Dennis, who was wonderful. And I was very, very lucky at the end of my time doing my PhD. I went straight from a PhD to a lectureship and a college fellowship at Oxford. So this was, you know, quite odd, because people were constantly telling me when I did a PhD that I'd killed my career working with Dennis and doing a Bayesian topic. And to get Oxford, this was the first statistics post created in the Maths Institute at Oxford. So I could have got it because they didn't know anything about statistics. They didn't even know that Bayesian statistics was a terrible thing. But it actually was more subtle than that. The guy who'd gone to Oxford to lead probability and statistics was John Kingman, probabilist. And Dennis had taught John probability. And John was enormously fond of Dennis. So I think Dennis even, you know, helped with that job. And I was in Oxford for 3 years, and then I received a telephone call from Dennis asking me if I could be persuaded to come back to University College. And I didn't take much persuading because Oxford had many charms, many bright students, etc., including Dennis's daughter. But there wasn't a critical mass of like-minded statisticians and statistical activity. And there's a point there which has actually run through most of my life. Maybe it's just me particularly, but I think great work in the areas that we're in are done with a critical mass of people, bounce off each other, who stimulate each other. And so ever since then, I've tried to form great groups. But I can either stop now and let you take the next one, or I would like to talk a bit more in a minute about the atmosphere in London and the controversies and stuff that were.
Yeah, I think that would follow. I mean, you've already sort of said something about being you've already said something about being a PhD student at Dennis, and again, it was a very isolating experience in some ways, and I don't know whether you felt it was career limiting being a baby Bayesian at that time, or what you felt you were up against.
It certainly was. It was both difficult and hostile, but at the same time, you know, like gangs of kind of righteous martyrs, you sort of almost rejoiced in being beaten up all the time because it made you more special. But it was a bit fraught, and I said in particular, Royal Statistical Society discussion meetings were very stimulating. But if you read back through a lot of those, somebody would give a paper on whatever the topic was. Dennis, halfway through, would make a remark, and all the discussion after that was then attacking what Dennis had said about the paper, and didn't talk about the paper at all. And this went on for years. One thing I did learn was his kind of unflinching commitment to calm forensic support of arguments, even in the face of unpleasant attacks. And in the UK, he single-handedly actually forged the intellectual environment that made it possible, even if not entirely respectable, you know, to have a successful career as a Bayesian statistician. But if you go back through some of the stuff that was happening and the stuff that had happened at the end of the 50s and the early 60s, Fisher's book on statistical methods and scientific induction came out, I think, in about 1955. And Dennis made the mistake of reviewing it in 1957. And he followed up in 1958 by that famous paper, Fiducial Distributions and Bayes theory. And then he had, in 1960 in the Berkeley Symposium, the use of prior distributions, statistical inference and decision theory. And the next time he appeared kind of in public, Fisher turned up, and Fisher's reply to Lindley's stuff on fiducial arguments, I mean, every line you look, it's da-da-da-da-da, Mr. Lindley, not true. Da-da-da-da-da, Mr. Lindley, erroneous. And he falls into these traps because of his failure to recognize the problems to which his method may sometimes be correctly applied. And this kind of toing and froing had actually created a climate back there, end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, that ran through a lot of the Royal Statistical Society meetings thereafter.
Well, actually, I think connects in some ways to the, I think at least for quite a while there was a feeling amongst Bayesians of being an oppressed minority, being a bit of a cult, being a movement, a religious organization. I don't know. We're not really nested in faith, rather nested in axioms. But in any event, I don't know how that played out for you in those somewhat early days.
Well, it was kind of ironic. It used to annoy Dennis tremendously because the only thing we really had in common was being atheists. Atheists.
Atheists.
Yeah, so it was rather ironic being. But can I just backtrack? I think there's an interesting thing where the religion cult, but it's to do with axiomatics, I think, right? So in statistics, going back to axiomatics has somehow been seen as extreme or cult-like of the rest. But so it might be worth sort of saying that where Dennis came from on all this, he was very mathematical, and he had been enormously kind of excited by the Kolmogorov axiomatization of mathematical probability. And the Kolmogorov book was published in German sometime in the 40s or 50s. It was earlier than that. Now, one of the bondings between Dennis and his wife in their early days was she spoke German, and they were going to translate the book together. So it was really the axiom stuff, and a lot of what he was driven to do thereafter, and it links up with the Savage stuff really, was why don't we have something equivalent in statistics? Why isn't statistics underpinned in that firm axiomatic way? And the thing about axioms is if you accept axioms, then you have to believe what comes. So belief and, So he was driven, to seek the axiomatization, and he worked away at it himself. And Alan Wallace was Alan Wallace was visiting London and took Dennis to tea at the Ritz or somewhere, and suggested that he come to Chicago, because when Dennis told him what he was trying to do, he said, I've got a mate, Jimmy Savage, who's trying to do exactly the same thing. So this was about 1953, 54. But Dennis was driven to put things on a firm mathematical axiomatic basis. There was no driven by any Bayesian ideology or whatever. And all these guys cast the axiomatics in different ways, and they weren't like the Ramsey stuff earlier or the De Finetti stuff, which was explicitly about degrees of belief. This was just about the mathematics of, and in a sense, it's the mathematics of complete class theorems and all that stuff. And people expressed it in different ways. And in Dennis's paper, it was like weighting power curves rather than, but it was a weighting sort of function. And there's an interesting quote I'd just like to find, just to show what that motivation was, and that it was nothing to do with Bayesianism, subjectivism, or whatever. Lindley, in 1953, had a paper on statistical inference, and it was about complete class theorems. It was Wald-type stuff. And the lead discussants were George Barnard and Jack Good. And Jack Good said, you're standing on your head to do this. It's all much easier if you just think Bayes. To which Lindley replies, I am a confirmed frequentist. And therefore, if I introduce these weights, it is only because I do not see any other satisfactory alternative. So he's incredibly reluctant. Thanks.
Well, now I'm afraid to ask the next question, but who were the most significant influences in the 60s and 70s on those of you in the UK who were trying to build the subject and profile of Bayesian statistics?
Yeah, I mean, I have to speak somewhat personally because there were many of us to influence at the time. And it wasn't just the direct stuff, it was actually others working around it. So you could do your conventional reading lists, and, I forget who else was in. Phil David had joined UC at the time, so he was a kind of companion, but there weren't very many of us trying to do this stuff. And we read Jeffries, and we read Savage. And something else I don't think was mentioned today, very wonderful book, influential book, it's a collection of essays, Kaiberg and Smockler, which came out in '64. I think it's called Studies in Subjective Probability. And that had that David translation, and it had Ramsey and all the rest of it. So that was very much part of the background. In terms then of other kind of influences, the one that Steve did talk quite a bit of, Jack Good, although he wasn't around, and there's a story, why wasn't Jack Good a prominent professor in the UK? Because if you look at Steve's list this morning, apart from Dennis, that was the only kind of UK. Barnard creeps in, because he's kind of maverick, slightly on the side, but boy, is he clever. And the likelihood principle stuff was fundamental. But basically, it was Dennis. And Jack Good had not got a post in the UK, partly because he couldn't demonstrate all the fabulous stuff he'd done during the war. I mean, there is still a restriction on the technical aspects of that stuff with Turing, which is incredible. And so the post he wanted in Oxford actually went to Morris Bartlett. And at that point, Jack decided he'd had enough and went off to Virginia Polytechnic. So he wasn't around. Because I think it would have been fantastic, say 10 years, if both he and Lindy had been around in the UK, but he wasn't. So there was just Dennis really directly. And then, you know, we got to learn of more and more about data netting, and I rather stupidly embarked with an Italian friend around about 1970 in translating data netting, which ruined my social life for about 2 years. But that was a kind of interesting thing, and we were slightly obsessed, as you see, all this conversation is really about foundations and inference and the minutiae, you know, of axiom systems and all the rest of it. But to counteract that, we did, of course, get to know, although I don't think I was personally ever invited to one, the Zellner series of seminar. And so that was interesting. And another very influential thing on some of us was the stuff that came out from Box and Chow. And part of this is that it was kind of lonely in a sense. So the more big names who weren't ashamed to be in the club was kind of helpful in a strange sort of way. And of course, George Box had this fantastic reputation and had been a fantastically well-known applied statistician in the UK, working for Imperial Chemical Industries. And so it was helping as an antidote to this stuff, as you Bayesians were loaded with little zealots who wouldn't be able to analyze an applied problem if it hit you. You know, it was that kind of attitude. And then, and some of them are in the room, I guess, there were kind of, Art might help them, haters, but there were fellow travellers like Art Dempster, Don Fraser, who came at it slightly differently, but you know, did quite high-profile talks at the RSS and all the rest of it. And you felt, actually, you know, a lot of this is kind of similar, but what it's not similar to is Fisher or Neyman and Pearson. And of course, I was still in a generation where Egon Pearson was still alive and a figure in the UC department. But there was another guy who's not much mentioned, who was a very big and wonderful influence, and he was called Cedric Smith, and he was a geneticist, and a wonderful geneticist, a very influential geneticist, and he developed his own completely different kind of axiom system, which was about sort of partially ordered preferences and therefore interval probabilities. But he was, you know, we regarded him as a serious fellow traveller, and he always took the Bayesian side if there was this crack going on at RSS meetings. And then you had people off to the side. George Barnard's been mentioned a few times. I mean, you couldn't typecast George Barnard. And the only thing consistent about him is whoever gave a talk he disagreed with. But in terms of the likelihood principle, he was a fundamental influence. And I was glad that Alan Birnbaum was mentioned this morning, because Alan actually came over to London. I mean, it was a rather tragic ending to it all, but I mean, he was a really deep thinker. He was a very strange man. This is a true story, I swear. I once asked him the time, and he looked at his watch, and he was about to tell me, and of course the hand had moved on slightly. So he had to look back again, and after 3 or 4 minutes, he couldn't tell me the time. It wouldn't have been right. I don't know what the theologian this morning would have made. And then other people passed through, and it wasn't quite, you know, Gadambi and Thompson, you know, the beginnings of Bayes' kind of ideas and analysis in survey sampling. And just the beginnings of emergence of systematic look at problem areas. So remember, we're kind of fighting this thing that all you guys do is sit around all day discussing axioms and inference principles, you know, and umpteen papers on 2x2 tape. You wouldn't be able to analyze a serious problem if and I think that's actually shaped quite a lot of my attitude to life. But then along come people like Harrison and Stevens, who were rolling this stuff out with dynamic linear models. So you could do anything anybody else could do in time series from Bayes' point of view. And then I'll pause for a second, but those were the sort of things that were related, but there's one thing I want to say either now or later, which shocked some of us. It wasn't Bayesian, but it shocked us for another reason. Well, you want to do another one?
Well, I was just gonna say that this naturally leads to your views on the origin of the famous Valencia meetings and what they actually achieved and how much they changed over time, and your general thoughts of 9 such meetings.
Okay, well let me slip in before that then the other thing I was going to say, because in 1977, and just remember this climate again, where one is convinced that this is a really interesting way to think about the world. That there's a machine, there's a mode of thinking here, which is very powerful, and if you like, inescapable if you accept certain kinds of axiomatic approaches. But this constant refrain and accusation that you guys talk a good talk, but you can't actually solve really interesting problems, was lurking there. And it lurked a lot with me, lurked a lot more with me, I have to say, than Dennis. Dennis sometimes was really kind of wild. He'd say, why are you looking at multivariate problems when we don't really know how to do a 2x2 table yet? Well, Dennis, the world out there. So there was a PR problem, a bit of a PR problem. And the thing that actually I remember shaking me, it was a kind of wake-up call, was actually the EMR group. It was Dempster, Laird and Rubin, 77. Because that was a powerful way of taking huge, great classes of complicated things and getting into the middle of it and pulling it apart and doing that. And I just thought, I do have some sympathy with the critics, because we can't match that. So I have to say that 10 or 15 years of my life was devoted to one day I'll get you the EMR.
And we did.
So, and the Valencia thing, it was, okay, you have to know, those of you who can say, round about I can't remember the exact date, but mid-late 60s, we started a series of European meetings of statisticians. It was partly driven by a wonderful guy whose 80th is coming up in March, Bill van Swep in the Netherlands. And part of it was our funny little attempt in some ways to sidestep the Cold War. It was to create academic links with colleagues throughout Europe, in particular with Eastern Europe. And the way we did it was the meetings alternated between West and East each year. It was a very influential and changed a lot of lives. But in those meetings, so in the RSS, every time you got up and the word Bayes was mentioned, it was kind of metaphorically a hiss from the audience. Then you go off to the European meeting of statisticians. It's kind of full of Germans and Russians who booed rather than hissed, if you said. So you sort of felt, wouldn't it be nice to go to a meeting where you could actually talk about what you'd done, and what it meant, and what it solved, rather than you shouldn't have been doing that anyway. It pisses you off after a while. So Jose had been a student of Dennis's at UC, so he was one of that very small gang. He'd gone back to Spain by then and was creating the department in Valencia. And I don't remember the exact moment, but it was just, wouldn't it be nice to have our own kind of space where we can explore things intellectually, where we can be in semi-collegial, we all hated each other in different ways, but in a nice way. We just sort of embrace the debate rather than trying to do people down and all the rest of it. And I can't remember exactly when it gelled, but we thought we'll have our own meetings. And what happened, this was just after the Franco overthrow, so Spain in general, and Valencia in particular, were looking for opportunities to open up to the world. So I'm not sure they would have happened in the same way, except for the local government in Valencia was very keen to help anything, and the hotels were keen.
That was the second one. First one was just in the transition, political transition, and was the government, the first democratic government in Spain after the death of the dictator.
So that in a sense says why Valencia. There was this emerging kind of possibility, and if ever you wanted something organised, even saying it, Jose Miguel is the person to organise that. So that's how that kind of started. And Dennis was a figurehead. I don't think he ever did any organisation. He was like, he made the presidential speech at the beginning. But we although it was, we wanted a space, okay, it's two things. It was, we want a space in which to be Bayesian. And these bloody Americans never invited us to their conferences, so we wanted to be European. Well, and then we thought, well, that's pretty mean, actually. You know, that's acting as badly as they did. And so we got Maury on board, who had links out into the communities that, some of those communities that Steve mentioned this morning. So that's kind of how it came about. And the first one, there were about 70 of us. And we were in this hotel, and basically they said, just order whatever you want on the menu. We're just pleased to have your custom and so on. After 2 days, the manager of the hotel came to Jose and said, we have a problem. What's the problem? So one of your guests is eating his way through our caviar stocks. Jack could. So we had to restrict the menu from then on. But if you look back at the proceedings, we were still doing it. There was an awful lot of inference type discussion going on at that time. But then if you look over the 9 volumes, I think it's very interesting to see the historical, almost sociological shift of what the topics were and who was involved. Certainly in terms of numbers. What was the maximum we hit? 700? 600? Over 600. So that was quite extraordinary, that it helped gel and grow a community that felt, common intellectual cause, and something softer, which was friendships and networks. And the growing PhD students. I mean, back in the UK, there were so few of us, and I think it was true, in other places as well, that the only way you were going to be able to make an impact and expand and mushroom this stuff, because you wanted to pick off topics. If you look in the 60s, you see Bayesian approach to classification, Bayesian approach to calibration, blah, blah, blah. You're sort of entering and picking off these fields, but the world out there was huge. It was through PhD students. And so that mushrooming of the attendance of those meetings of young people was quite incredible. So I think it achieved. No, I think it's for others to say what it achieved.
Well, I was just going to say that we witnessed just a wonderful growth in the community, but I think there may be some people who lament the bit of the loss of collegiality that we had as a smaller community, and I don't know how you react to that.
No, I'm a go forth and multiply. So, I mean, I think, okay, we're all different, right? We're all motivated by different things. And in my youth, I loved trying to win kind of smart-ass axiomatic arguments with the unwashed and the uninitiated. But I did think the world out there was quite interesting in its own way. I got heavily involved with the pharmaceutical industry and things like pharmacokinetics, understanding how pattern of drug concentration in the body over time, or pharmacodynamics, which is how that concentration turns into outcomes like pain relief or whatever. These are all non-linear models, and you have to try them out on loads of subjects. So you're into hierarchical non-linear modeling. And there are lots of outliers, so you don't use normal distributions and so on. So I wanted to solve problems like that. And Udi Makov, who's not here, was a PhD student back in UC days, and we're now allowed to say it. We did Russian submarine tracking. We did the algorithms that you learned the signatures of noise. Every submarine hums in a different way. And they try and lose you by doglegging and all sorts of things. So you've got non-linear dynamics in the tracking problem. And you've got noisy stuff out there, so you don't ever know whether you've actually received a true signal or a noise. And if you've got the signal, of course, you've got to update. If you've got the noise, you don't. But if you go n times, you've got 2 to the n possibilities. So you've got mixture explosions of non-linear dynamics. And I thought that stuff was really interesting. And I wanted to solve those kind of problems. But that required an army of PhD students.
Yeah, well, actually, in some sense, you've already alluded to this, because I think, as you noted, in the 60s and early 70s, a lot of the controversy was over foundations, and then we started to move more into applications and computation. And I don't know how you would characterize why we saw this shift.
By the way, I've got a bad throat, that's why I'm drinking out. Out and alcohol. I think it was partly a generational thing, that people like myself, in a way, Dennis had done a fabulous kind of job. But as you saw from the video where you say you could close your eyes and it could have been 40 years ago, that probably wasn't so clever, because the world sort of moved on. And Dennis really was not going to make a transition into heavy, complex problems in computation and so on and so forth. But that's where the action was in the world, because technologically, the ability to collect, you know, incredibly large amounts of very intricate data, the realization, even intellectually, that modeling, structure of modeling, conditional independence, graphical models, decomposition of probabilities. At the same time, there was this growing stuff in machine learning, expert systems, etc., which some of us kind of saw was, hey, this is interesting stuff, and hey, this is actually close to what we do. And then people like David Spiegelhalter and Stefan Larenson and Phil David and others got into that space and got involved with people like Judith Pearl and others. So you've got that whole world of machine learning. My own friends in Cambridge who were in the engineering department, the signal processing department of the University of Cambridge, has been doing complex Bayesian analysis for 25 years. I didn't just call it signal processing. And so there's a danger, if we hadn't wanted students to get into that space, of kind of having won the intellectual argument, would then become redundant because you didn't carry it through to do stuff. But of course, it all hinged on this problem of being able to compute, being able to implement. And I thought that was a really important problem, and sort of decided almost as a mission that that's what I wanted to do. So I can track 10 wasted years of my life trying to adapt quadrature and adaptive quadrature and orienting axes to make it, you know, Gauss-Legendre polynomials work here, there, and everywhere. And eventually got up to 8 dimensions. And every time we had a wonderful guy called John Naylor in Ottawa, who wrote this thing called, it was originally called Bayes250, because it would do, I don't know what it's called for, because it would do 4 dimensions. Anyway, we got up to 8 dimensions, and you were sure, and we had these fancy kind of things, and every time we got up a dimension, we'd have a party and so on. And the non-linear pharmacokinetic stuff I was trying to do to see Geiger had 640 parameters. It was all not kind of great. And funnily enough, we're going to end up in Monte Carlo, but there was a paper of Jack Good's here in 1967. I remember it. Bayesian significance test for multinomials. And in there's a lot of approximate asymptotic analysis there. You know, the kind of stuff in applied maths people did throughout the 19th century, but it's all redundant because it takes 2 microseconds on a computer. Anyway, so Jack Good done a huge amount of asymptotic approximation. Everybody's really mean and said that's just not good enough, doesn't work, does it? And at the end of that 67 one, Jack said, "You're right. Perhaps I should have turned to Monte Carlo methods." As far as I'm aware, he never did. But, you know, it was kind of in the air, really. And given the EM algorithm, given iterated conditional modes, I don't understand why it took some of us so long. And in my case, it took until Al Gelfand visited Nottingham and I was explaining something to him because it was so dumb. I had to go over it 2 or 3 times. And he said, "Oh, that's the Gibbs sampler." So that's how I had to do it. So we opened the MCMC candy store around about 1988. And I think once you can compute stuff, or once it's within grasp, you know, if you refine the stuff, there was then a kind of explosion because it changes the mental attitude. Actually, I really could analyze this. And it was quite frustrating knowing these wonderful problems. I mean, all this non-linear stuff I had with Supergragi for years, just I don't know what to do with it, you know, which was very frustrating. So I think that it went hand in hand, but it went hand in hand with expectations. If statisticians were going to be useful to the rest of the world, engineering or you know, expert systems or whatever, I mean, you had to join in that thing. The world was getting more complex.
I think there's also the serendipity of availability of more and more inexpensive high-speed computing. And, you know, so the timing was right. You know, perhaps a decade earlier would not have.
And sometime in the mid-80s, there wasn't a culture in the UK research councils of thinking of giving really expensive heavy-duty machines to statisticians. And sometime in the mid-80s, I actually got the first load, and I actually got the first graphics machines and printers and all the rest of it. And we felt, you know, we were big boys, color graphics.
So can I change a little bit to you referred to some of the earlier heated controversy, or shall I say controversy, and is it sort of less fun being a Bayesian if you're not insulted anymore, or are there still some more current controversies that you think we have to deal with?
I actually, unless you're a very weird person, I don't think it's much fun being kind of insulted and disrespected. But so I think that kind of stuff, as far as I can see, is kind of more or less disappeared. I doubt that it actually disappeared because Bayesians won over people who weren't attracted to axioms. I think there are more people out there interested in complicated applications who appreciate the toolkit and don't give a damn about the arguments, you know, and so on. I think that what can be controversial, well, I mean, you have this parallel universe going on of O Bayes, right? Not OH Bayes, exclamation mark, oh Bayes, O Bayes. So there are clearly differences of approach, and arguments will continue about tactics and ways of producing, you know, there's something in the human soul that doesn't give up searching for the holy grail of the default from prior. I mean, I'm more pragmatic myself. I think, so if you take stuff I used to do in the pharmaceutical industry, people really there with clinical trials, and I think this is right, were seriously concerned about Bayesian analysis, because why won't the pharmaceutical company stick in, you know, they obviously think this bloody thing works, or they won't be spending £1 million. So why their prior is it'll, you know, 10% improvement or something. So, you know, who's prior? That kind of discussion. And I think it's a very legitimate thing to think about. But I don't think, you know, you have to retreat into, well, here's my formula. It's all pragmatic. So in the pharmaceutical industry, really all you needed to do was say, what is the most adversarial position you could adopt against the pharma company? Think of that as your prior, and then they don't win unless the data pushes that into the positive space. And so it's nobody's real prior that's being used, but the machine and the thought process and the mechanics is being used to say, whatever's out there, this data tells you that this is okay. And I think there are lots of kind of tricks of that. I used to love, I don't see it used anymore, but some of I was rereading all these kind of things in the archive of the Royal Statistical Society, and outrageously, I quite liked one of my papers, because it was the device of imaginary observations. Everybody remember that? That was Jack Good again. And I was trying to look at, you know, what you do about Bayes factors in linear models when you've got vague priors over everything, because you get this unresolved constant. But if you've got some structured design, you could always imagine having had 1 or 2 runs of the structured design. What would those have? And so I was brilliant. And in rereading it, there's a line which says, by the well-known properties of Hadamard matrices, and then I trot out some lines of gibberish. I can't remember what a Hadamard matrix is. But I think the pragmatism of not just thinking this does not mean that you stick in somebody's prior and something comes out the other end. It is a balancing act. Left hand side is the right hand side. And whether we play creatively with one side or the other, seems to me it depends on what you're trying to achieve. And the farmer one is a good example. If against any adversarial prior you can think of that means something like adversarial, if the data tells you this drug is winning, it's winning.
Yeah, but I think you've actually alluded to, I think, an issue that's worth a couple of words, and that is, nowadays most people would say, quote, Bayes works, but does that mean Bayes is reduced to a tool, or is it more, can we still retain it as an inference philosophy, and how pure does one have to be to still be Bayesian in the 21st century?
I don't know how many people are in this room, but I doubt if there's a kind of cloning of a particular kind of view. Some people are moved by axiomatics. Remember, Dennis would never have got into this at all if he felt there wasn't an axiomatic basis for the statistics. Others are moved by applications. So I don't care anymore, really, about, I wouldn't mind if we'd never used the word Bayesian statistics again. I think if we use this sort of balancing thing of stuff in and stuff out in creative ways to, in a sense, shape the boundaries of what we learned, and if there's a major decision to be made, if the probability's gone overwhelmingly for it one way or the other, whatever you felt, there's still interesting stuff. I think about populations of priors and that, but it's all pragmatics. But the underlying machine as an algorithm for fitting it all together in a reasonably coherent way, fine. But life is really complicated, and I don't think you can always do it. So I think somewhere in Dave and Eddie it says, here are my 700 pages, but take it all with a big pinch of salt.
Well, if that's the case.
Or a glass of...
Okay. No, I guess this perhaps leads to maybe the last question. So what does the future hold for Bayesian statistics? Is even the label still meaningful and relevant? And where are we headed?
Time will tell. I think in a certain funny sense, I think the ultimate triumph of Bayesian statistics would be if the words weren't used anymore. It's the old Marxist in the withering away of the state. In that it just becomes such a natural, if not the only way, to try and coherently get things to fit together. And now with the kind of computational schema, even if you were a likelihood hoodlum trying to explore likelihoods, you'd hope you could normalize it somehow and use MCMC. Right? You know, the first time I appeared in print, there was a paper by Kolfleisch and Sprott, and it was this problem for likelihood guys. What do you do with the nuisance parameters? And there's something in a variance component model where all that stuff relies on phrases like no available information, which you can define however you want. So I was a real smart ass, sort of 24-year-old or whatever. So I had 2 different definitions of no available information that completely screwed up their whole paper. They didn't see it that way, but it was quite clear. How did I get onto that? Oh, yeah.
The future.
The future. Increasingly, I think the impact of what everybody here does is actually more and more solving in whatever that means. The analysis and getting understanding and getting good decisions and good policies out of very complex things, and often very complex high-dimensional things. As far as I can see, something like the Bayes paradigm, with or without a pinch of salt and with loads of computation, is now the overwhelming way of doing that. So I don't care what people call it, I just rejoice in the fact that that's what people do.
Wonderful. Can I just ask one personal question, and that is, how do you deal with this issue of personal uncertainty versus rigorous science? In the sense that, you know, how subjective can one be and still do, quote, real science? And I'm obviously playing devil's advocate with these words, but you often get asked to defend, and I don't know what your preferred defense is.
It would be the obfuscatory one of saying, what on earth do you mean by real science? You say, well, something objective versus so, well, what's objective? So I have a very strong view. The only conceivable meaning for objective is a consensus of subjectivity. So everything we end up believing or doing or writing or whatever is a human enterprise, and if it's called a law or it's called something objective, that's because enough of the great and the good have said it. No more, no less. Real science is only what we all agree it is at the time.
Well, I think we're done. Thanks very much.
I suspect you're not quite done. We have plenty of time. We started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative, and we'll end on time, 10 minutes late. I feel fairly confident there are some questions or comments or thoughts to add to the mix. And if you've got a really smart, incisive comment, there's a glass down here. Questions?
Would anybody like to say a few words about Dennis Lindley's contribution to the Higgs boson discovery?
No.
You want to say something?
No.
Good question.
There's been a lot of talk about how, in the early days, Bayesian ideas were resisted, and this feeling of threat and so forth. And my question is, as long as there was a tenure-based system, why were those feelings of being besieged so strong? Because usually once you have tenure, best license to publish what you want, isn't it? Why wasn't that enough?
Okay, two things. One, my formative years were, first thing, get a job, right? So before you enter that thing, there's an issue. And tenure was abolished in the UK in 1986. There is no tenure in UK education.
But at the time when people were feeling besieged as Bayesians, there was tenure, wasn't there? Why was that feeling of besiegement, if that's a word, so strong?
Well,
What's the question? I couldn't hear. Would you?
Let me repeat the question. So the question is, in the pre-1986 days, when there was a tenure system operating in British universities, why was this defensive attitude so entrenched? Why was there this notion that we're being besieged?
okay, can I just unpick? I mean, degrees of being besieged. If you were doing your PhD and hadn't got a job, right, you'd acknowledge that that would be one of it. The other bit would be about publishing, that you did feel that if you were trying to publish a Bayesian paper, it wasn't going to kind of sympathetic referees an awful lot of the time.
Could I
all the time?
Could I a little prod here? The RSS you alluded to half a dozen times in your discussion. That was a pretty big factor in those days in terms of the lock it had on the notion of what was right and what was proper to do in academic statistics and probability of statistics more properly.
Yeah, it was, but I would say it actually wasn't. It didn't behave kind of badly. You know, my thesis was essentially an RSS red paper in 1971. So there wasn't a kind of blockage in that sense, but you sort of felt it had to be something really rather kind of special and high profile to get through the net. Whereas if you look back through those RSS volumes, Series B, there's a huge amount of just everyday kind of frequentist trivia? You really had to do something kind of violent to get a Bayes paper?
Any other
It
thoughts?
just maybe maybe paranoia. We were all paranoid.
So you mentioned that Bayesian will have won when the word disappears. And this maybe requires the general public or those less mathematically inclined adopting our way of thinking. How do you think this is achievable?
I'm not quite sure I understand the premise. I don't think the general public goes around with an armory of different kind of statistical taxonomic terms in their head. I think the general public, if anything, vaguely occasionally recognizes the word statistician. And it's probably something to do with the football result. So I don't think that's really the issue. I was just really mainly thinking it would be a great success if it was such a normal on-board mode of thinking about complex things that you know, it's just the way you do it. You don't constantly think, what am I doing? I mean, for years, don't you think maximum likelihood was like that? People did it, but they didn't think, I'm being a likelihood statistician. I calculated the maximum likelihood. So one would like it almost to be just culturally, the way you think about big complex things. You've got all these inputs that have to come together. And some of the mathematical, I mean, seeing, I mean, hierarchical models is such baby stuff. Right? I mean, the kind of general graphical model structure that you can see in incredible numbers of applications has become just the normal way of doing stuff, and you know, relates to the probabilistic networks, expert systems, etc. And I think just people get on with it. They don't sit around wondering what to call it today. So I think it'd be a success if we didn't worry about it.
One last question, Steve.
So we have 600 people plus come to the ISPO World meetings. There's about 6,000 statisticians that show up at the JSMs. For every one of those statisticians, there's 20,000 other people that have MBAs and are essentially taught to do statistics by plugging numbers into Excel and looking at compression coefficients and p-values. There's sort of an order of magnitude step that I think we need to take in order to become, those guys need to be Bayesian too in order for that word to disappear. We're a very small minority in a very big world, and much of the rest of the world has no idea that we're here, despite the fact that we've had tremendous successes. So what do we do about those guys?
Well, all of you are employed out there, you'll be pleased to know there's still work to be done.
One really last question, Jose.
Well, it's related to that. I haven't seen really much of an improvement in the proportion of Bayesian teaching in universities in the world. And that seems to be at the same level it was in the 80s. Why, and is that important?
I'm going to assume that you mean in statistics departments. If you were to take into account engineering departments, computer science departments, I think there'd be a different story. Anyway, who knows? We'd have to quantitatively look. All I know is the world looks very different than it did in 1968 when Gauss did.
And at that point, we'll thank Adrian and Alan. As we move to the next speaker, I'd like to ask Adrian to clear up the dishes.
I'll bust the table.